All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you today, Mike.
Hello.
Hi, I'm with Mike Burke today. And Mike, we met about a week ago when you and Elizabeth Spivak interviewed
That's
me
correct.
for the ILV podcast, The Dissidents. And so that was our first time meeting. And I really, really enjoyed speaking with you. And it sounded like you had a very interesting story yourself for why you are now doing what you're doing. And
Mm,
I thought it would be great to have the opportunity to speak one-on-one and hear more about you and about what your backstory is. So thank you so much for joining me today.
pleasure. Um, where should we start?
Yeah, well,
Um,
so you found yourself hosting a podcast, and so what brought you to be doing that, and what were you doing before, and what is your focus right now with work?
right. Okay. So, how did I get to the podcast? So Elizabeth and I were members of Counterweight, which has, at least for now, ceased to exist. It might get resurrected at some point. And
Mhm.
Counterweight was formed by our friend Helen Pluckrose as an organization that was broadly liberal,
Mhm.
um, that would push back against the excesses of critical social justice. So at the time, there were lots of people who were pushing back against critical social justice from a right-wing point of view. So a lot of
Mhm.
conservatives, and that's great. I don't hate conservatives, by the way, or Christians either. Lots of friends who are both. But we felt that there was room for something that was a bit more liberal than that. So we created that organization, or Helen created that organization. I joined up later, initially as one of the the heads of the academic section, but then also as one of the board members as well. Elizabeth was too. Yeah. How did I join Counterweight?
And how yeah, you were in academia before that.
Yeah, so I I think the first time when I really came across critical social justice as an individual
Mhm.
um, was when I was being insulted on Facebook for being white, which was a bit strange, and I didn't understand where that was coming from or what it was about. And
Mhm.
then somebody told me, you need to educate yourself. And as somebody who's on the spectrum, when you tell us to do something literal, often we will do something literal. So I did educate myself, and I read, I would say, quite extensively into critical race theory, into feminism, queer theory, critical theory, the original critical theory rather than critical
Mhm.
race theory, postmodernism, um, and I found in that literature that there was lots to dislike. I found that there was some worthwhile stuff in there as well. But what I found most of all was that once I armed myself with that knowledge, and then I went after people who were going after me with this stuff, is that the scholars, even the academics, they're saying, I'm an academic at this university, sometimes quite prestigious places, they didn't actually know what they were talking about.
Mhm.
So many of them hadn't really invested much time in the academic literature that they claimed they had. So they were
Mhm.
frauds, in other words.
Mhm. Mhm.
And what I found is that, even within critical social justice, I mean, a lot of the academics who we would consider within critical social justice would reject that, because that's a term that comes along later and is used by Robin DiAngelo and is then picked up. And they don't like woke either, right? They used to like it, but they don't like it anymore, since it's become largely pejorative.
Right.
But what I found is that there are some nuanced scholars in that field, and that they don't behave like this. The more nuanced ones, they might not kind of object to cancellations, but they're hardly like the pitchfork wielding kind of types. So I found things were quite more sophisticated than I initially thought. Um, so then, as an academic, as I first encountered it, I was doing a master's degree in education, and I come from a skeptical background. So ghosts and monsters has always been my thing since I was a kid, and I've always been disappointed to find out that they don't exist. or at least there's no evidence for them. And that kind of led me into skepticism, trying to seek out evidence for paranormal claims, which then led me to critical thinking, logic, being aware of psychological biases, how do we make mistakes? How can we avoid making mistakes? And so I thought, well, education, let's push critical thinking. Wouldn't that be an amazing thing? And then I got into education and I wanted to do my master's thesis on critical thinking. And what I discovered is that, oh, yeah, critical thinking, all that nice stuff that you're talking about, that's all very good and important, by which they meant it's not important at all. This is critical thinking in the weak sense, but critical thinking in the strong sense is emancipatory reasoning.
Oh my gosh. So there's really two kinds at this point.
Right. So
Wow.
this comes from a guy who died recently, God bless his soul, a guy called Richard Paul, who was the head of the American Foundation for Critical Thinking, I think it's called. It's an organization that pushes critical thinking in schools, and
critical thinking.
No.
Oh, okay.
Not in my opinion. I mean, they may do a little bit of that. They may do a little bit of that, but certainly what they seem to focus on is critical thinking in the strong sense, is what they call it. This is what they call critical thinking in the strong sense.
Oh, it's a redefinition. Yeah,
it's a complete redefinition.
Okay.
So they try and reconcile two fundamentally different ways of looking at the world. So certainly critical thinking as we would know it, let's say naive critical thinking, because that's what people naively think it is in education. It's not that really.
Okay.
Would be just what I said: logic,
right,
fallacies, biases, hasty generalizations, so on and so forth. Whereas, and they will say this is all very important. They don't mean it's very important, but they will say it's very important. But then they'll say that critical thinking in the strong sense is basically critical theory. So this notion that you are being oppressed, that you are not necessarily aware of the ways in which you are being oppressed, and that you need to either be educated or work very hard and educate yourself in order to learn the ways in which you're being oppressed, and then you gain critical consciousness, right?
So,
which is woke now. The new articulation of it's woke because it's all tied into race and stuff like that.
This is the first time I'm hearing this, and that's amazing.
Right.
That's really interesting. So weak critical thinking, a weak type of critical thinking is using your analytical skills to dissect the logic of an argument, but strong critical thinking is applying critical social justice and this social hierarchy matrix to a scenario.
To be fair, it predates critical social justice by quite a bit. I would say that the most robust articulation of it is probably Paulo Freire in a book called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And this is what but it's as a theme, it's certainly there in much earlier thinkers like Horkheimer, going back to his, I think it was in 1938 essay, Traditional and Critical Theory. Where traditional theory is, learning about science or politics or whatever, whereas critical theory is this knowledge that is, they'd call it praxis, right? This knowledge that is also used as part of political action. And certainly they kind of saw critical theory as being, in many ways, the higher form of theory, because it's able to bring about this kind of change. Because
it's contextually based, and it's based in the society as they see it, in this, this disparate hierarchical kind of
and let's
system.
Let's give the devil his due here, because I don't think any of these critical theorists would have had any time for the likes of D'Angelo and Kendi. I mean, they're painful to read because they just write in this kind of much in the same way that people like Foucault write, which is just it's just occasionally makes a good point, but it's just painful to read. But there is something to be said for example, I mean, imagine you work in a factory, and you earn enough money to live a reasonable life. You go home, you buy a couple of beers from the convenience store on the way back, something I do quite often. You then open them up and you watch whatever it is on TV, ER or whatever you like on TV, and that kind of makes you content. You don't go and challenge the fact that your labor might be worth more than you're receiving for it, and that you could readdress the social balance were you able to do that. So you're kind of pacified by television and beer, if you like. fine. I think there's something to be said for that. Certainly what they weren't getting at is this kind of very racialized, I mean, out of that kind of the original critical theorist, there is Marcuse, who's a bit of a nut job. He might have kind of gone down that route, but I think he's the only one. And they wouldn't have been at the whole woke thing where, you know, everything is racism, and you know, they would have been much more conciliatory, trying to band people together rather than seek to divide them, which is what's going on right now. But certainly in education, what I was really surprised to find was that critical thinking that we would think of as critical thinking, and the kind of thing that parents think of as critical thinking, what they would want for their kids, has been swapped out for something completely different. And the two are they're not compatible.
No,
right? Because
they're different. It's a different process.
Fundamentally, epistemologically, right? So epistemology, the philosophy of how do we know things, right? So how do we know things from a critical thinking point of view would be logical, empirical, right? There are certain objective facts that we can know about the world, and we test them via the scientific method or via the application of logic. You know, I probably don't need to define that, but so that would be the critical thinking in the weak sense that they have it in education right now. But the strong sense is much more, well, we are being oppressed. Well, how do we know we're being oppressed? Well, we are being oppressed.
Circular.
Yeah, well, teleological completely. You know, that is taken as like, you know, how do we know the Bible is the word of God, right? Well, because God wrote it. You know, it's that kind of argument. And so, you know, again, I don't mean to say that I don't mean to say that anything that comes out of critical theory is bad. I don't think that, you know, I've read it and there's some useful stuff in there. But I think what bothered me wasn't that they were teaching students about this way of thinking, you know, in the sense that this is one way of thinking and this is how it could be used. It's that they were requiring students to agree with this, and in some articulations of critical race theory, they've been doing the same thing. It's not that they're saying, you know, his critical race theory originates from Derek Bell, who took it from critical legal studies. It goes through Kimberly Crenshaw, who wrote an interesting paper, and here is what she argued.
It's the difference between teaching it alongside other theories and teaching it as the vehicle through which they're teaching you everything. Precisely,
indoctrination versus education, which is, and I gave a presentation about this in, I think it was 2019, at Heterodox Academy in New York at the conference they had there. So that's a roundabout way. So I wrote my dissertation on that. I was assigned a dissertation supervisor. I didn't talk to him at all. I just did a complete academic broadside and submitted my paper on the last possible day. So there was no back and forth.
And it was about the contrast between the two kinds of critical
education versus indoctrination.
Okay, wow. Okay.
And how the two epistemologies are fundamentally hostile to each other. You can't reconcile them. You can't say this is weak sense and strong sense when they're completely antagonistic. So weak sense and strong sense seems to imply that you can use one or the other. Well,
that they're degrees of one another.
Right, and they're not. Exactly, that they're degrees of one another, that they're somehow compatible. They're not. You know, one is a very faith-based ideological way of reasoning, and the other is, you know, much more objective form of analysis that would be more consistent with what we would think to be considered critical thinking. So they were, you know, antithetical ways of thinking. And so I did quite well on that thesis. You know, if I was to publish it now, I don't think I would do very well. I'd probably be failed out right now. But at the time, I think I lived in more educated, more enlightened times. So I was very worried about that. And I saw it coming in education before things got to the point where the word woke had become a pejorative, for example, or critical race theory had become a pejorative before most people had heard of that.
Will you say again when that was? Because I don't know if I caught it. What year was that you were in the master's program?
I think I must have finished around about 2014.
14? Okay.
I think.
Okay, so in the
like you, I'm not a numbers-driven person, so I might have got that wrong. So
but that time-ish in the early teens.
Yeah,
early to mid-teens.
I think that looking back at it, the signs of this stuff were all in place even earlier than that. Like, I mean, I remember being an undergrad in 2000 and seeing safe spaces and stuff like that crop up. But there was no ideological bullying, or at least there wasn't very much of it. I never experienced that.
But in hindsight, you can see, you can
but
put
in hindsight,
it together.
you can see it there, right?
Yeah.
But certainly I got into academia, in education, and I started seeing teachers failing students, for example, for objecting to ideas from feminism, or for objecting to ideas from critical race theory. And again, let me be clear, these academics who are doing this, I'm not saying that they were the best feminist scholars in the world, nor am I saying that there aren't plenty of feminist scholars who would look at those academics and roll their eyes and think, oh, for goodness sake. I have a very good friend who's a very intelligent feminist scholar who absolutely has no time for these people whatsoever, and has no problem saying it.
This goes back to what you're saying about the kind of the cursory knowledge that a lot of people actually have of this stuff. The way that it's being applied is not really in keeping with some of the fundamentals of, if you were to actually do the research.
Well, I mean, if you were to drill down, so I mean, we've drilled down to kind of critical theory, you know, and which was, again, it comes from Marxism, and say what you like about Marxism, and there's plenty of nasty stuff to be said about Marxism. If you want to see that, go onto the Dissidents podcast, check out the chat we had with Ken Pope, who is the director, the CEO of the Victims from Communism Memorial Foundation, where we specifically get into Marxism. But the one thing that can be said that's positive about Marxism is that it doesn't discriminate on the basis of gender or race. Or, you know, so it's very, very conciliatory. But this stuff isn't conciliatory. And as you allude to, the people who are arguing it, they don't understand. They don't drill down. If they did drill down, they would be far more conciliatory than they actually are. Derek Bell doesn't say that all white people are evil. Derek Bell, for example, you know, the progenitor of critical race theory, he actually says that there are plenty of white people who joined the fight against slavery and racism, not because it was in their interests to, but because for no other reason than they thought it was the right thing. So they don't drill down into the basis of critical race theory. They certainly don't drill down into the basis of critical theory, the earlier critical theory. And they don't, and this is like my problem with Jordan Peterson, for example, who is a very knowledgeable person on cognitive psychology and clinical psychology, and you should absolutely listen to him about things like that. But you know, his dismissal of postmodernism, you know, they don't drill down into postmodernism either. So, you know, Jordan Peterson, for example, will say, well, I don't get how you can reconcile Marxism and postmodernism, right? And the answer is you can't. And that's the whole point of postmodernism. So the idea of the postmodernists had, and this is why the postmodernists would reject critical social justice as well, by the way. So we've gone through the critical theory types, the critical race theory types, and the postmodernists like Foucault would have no time for it either. And the reason for that is because these guys had grown up as Marxists, right? So they had seen Marxism as a useful tool of pushing back against certain powerful groups in order to win concessions for people who had been more on the fringes of society. And then they had to stand by and watch in horror when all of their dreams came true, and the Soviet Union became the evil empire that it was. So what they had seen was good and useful became evil. You know, and then Foucault didn't recognize until a lot later that the same thing was happening in China as well, and arguably even worse. Well, it happened in every communist country. And so what they developed is this idea of meta-narratives, right? So as soon as, you know, any way of knowing the world very arguably is a story, that we weave stories about ourselves and about the way that society exists. Certainly Marxism would be a story, critical race theory would be a story, but a meta-narrative becomes a way in which everything is explained through this narrative, right? So critical social justice, more or less everything is explained in terms of oppression. Certainly the dumbed down version, you know, right? And look, there are some people who say, okay, well, why are you attacking the dumbed down version? Because there are more sophisticated versions that exist. And my answer would be, I'd love to attack the more sophisticated versions, but they're not as powerful.
But that's not what's being
No.
spread the way what you're talking about is this, that there's this level on which a lot of these are valuable and fascinating
Right.
and worthy sociological constructs to talk about
Correct.
on a high level academic basis. But what's happened is that these are being applied, and the way that they're being applied, it is incredibly dumbed down. And that was one of
Right.
my first experiences with it, was like, this is really being taught in a graduate program. This is like eighth
Right.
grade level thinking that we're doing here, if even that. And it's just the way that it's being applied is, it's incredibly reductive.
Correct.
Mhm.
And we're allowing, one of the problems is that we are allowing lots of stupid people into academia. I mean, I say stupid, but people whose brains are not cut out for academia, who should do other things. Stupid is probably too strong a word, but I'm frustrated.
Yeah, I hear you.
No, because I'm homeless. I mean, this is where I always dreamt about being. I dreamt
Mhm.
about being in a kind of life where we can have the kind of conversations that I'm having, because to most people, this kind of conversation is weird, and that's fine. But, we're a form of life as well. And we should be allowed to do this because we can bring certain tangible benefits. And then, to find out that academia is being conquered by normies who don't think about things in any depth. And this is the point, right? So the critical social justice, the forms of what we now call critical social justice, and I can give you examples, right? I mean, it's not just Horkheimer and Adorno and Lyotard and Foucault from postmodernism. It's not just these old famous thinkers. Charles Mills, and again, some of the stuff he says is batshit crazy in my opinion, but he's definitely worth reading. He died recently as well. Even Kimberly Crenshaw in Mapping the Margin. I mean, this is stuff that's worth reading. These people have a point, and we used to be at a point in society where it's like, I'm probably going to disagree with 70% of this paper, but 30%, wow, that's more than enough reason for me to read it. Or even, I just want to know how the other side thinks. That's reason enough to read it. So there are sophisticated arguments in the kind of family of ideas that we now call critical social justice. A lot of them are bad, including from some of the big intelligent thinkers, but some of them aren't so bad. And but the point is that a lot of these new scholars, and they're academics, and some of them are at prestigious universities, they haven't read this stuff. I mean, I've been in the situation where I've been engaging with somebody who is an academic at a prestigious university in the United States, who this is all in her identity. And, I thought, well, okay, how am I going to build a bridge with this person? I'm not a normie, so these kind of things are hard for me, right? So I thought, well, maybe I can talk about a bit of the literature that she invests her identity into that I actually quite like. So I was like, oh, what do you think of Charles Mills' critique of ideal theory? Nothing. No, she changed the subject because she hadn't read it, or if she had read it, she hadn't understood it. Not sufficient enough to have a conversation. So yeah, but here's the point.
So you're talking about people who are proponents of these ideas that have
who are professors at prestigious
that don't have the
universities.
knowledge of the source material.
No, they can't. That's why that in your grad school, probably you went into a class and it was just all
Twitter memes,
right? Yeah. YouTube videos. That's the level of their understanding.
That is the level.
And so the next thing would be, okay, well, there are these people, and that's a shame. They're all idiots. Okay, I agree with that. Why aren't you going after Charles Mills and engaging with people like Charles Mills and the more sophisticated arguments? What I do, on the one hand, is evidenced by the fact that I'm able to talk about them here. But the sad thing is that those are not the most consequential forms of the argument. If they were, we wouldn't be in the mess we're in right now. Right. It's the dumbed down version from Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo. And this isn't my opinion. We can demonstrate this in terms of book sales. Right. If you look at what's the bestseller on Amazon, right? The constitutional law, the bestseller 3 years ago when I last checked, was Critical Race Theory and an Introduction by Stefancic and Delgado. Which is a load of crap. And it says that critical race theory completely rejects, I'm paraphrasing, critical race theory is at least highly critical of liberalism, or it just outright rejects it. That's what they say. They haven't read Charles Mills, because Charles Mills actually is a critical race theorist who absolutely embraces liberalism, albeit a new form of it. But you can't, so they're reading this dumbed down nonsense, and that's what's consequential. So those are the arguments I have to go after. Yeah,
and the book that we used in my graduate program, Counseling the Culturally Diverse by Daryl Wing Su, This
Oh
book is,
yeah,
it feels like
famous
it's
for
all,
introducing microaggressions.
yes,
Deraldine
exactly.
Sue,
It
right? Yeah.
exactly. And it's all, and it's, he self sources over and over throughout his whole book. Like if you look at his footnotes, his sources are his own work. So, I mean, it's just, it's all made up.
The whole concept of microaggression. I mean, here's like, if I let's say let's accept the concept of microaggression. If we accept the concept of microaggression, then the concept of microaggression is itself a microaggression,
Yeah.
right? Because if you're
Yeah.
neurodiverse,
Yeah.
let's use their language. I prefer mad, but I'm I'm like on the spectrum. So no, I'm serious, because like I don't expect society to recognize me as normal and the rest of it. So like I might as well make my peace with it. So I'm mad, and as a consequence of being mad, I will communicate. I will think firstly in a way that most people don't, and therefore I will communicate in a way that most people don't. And therefore, as I've experienced, I'm more likely to be misunderstood than most people are. Which means that I'm more likely to be accused of a microaggression.
Yeah.
Which means that the concept of microaggression is a microaggression.
That's really interesting. That is really interesting.
So it doesn't, I mean, look, that's from
Well,
a kind of like,
I
I'm
think
just being playful.
Well, I think that's really charming in an Alice in Wonderland sort of way.
Yeah, and hence the accent. No, I'm just being playful with the concept.
Yeah,
What I really think about it is it's a tyranny of the subjective.
Well, and it's internally contradictory as well, because a
Right.
microaggression is something that's an what is it? It's a intentional or unintentional act of aggression that's small, and so you can't have an unintentional aggression. There's no such thing as something that's unintentionally aggressive, because in order to be aggressive, that implies a certain kind of intent. You don't walk into a room and kick a trash can accidentally aggressively. No. The aggression is the intent. So when you remove intent, I mean, microaggression just falls apart on itself.
No, it completely does. But I think it's much worse than that. What it enables is a kind of tyranny of the subjective, where it's like your intention doesn't matter. All that matters is how I feel about things.
How you feel. Yeah, that's true.
But that's pathological. And I've encountered this, by the way. I mean, one of the first times when I had to deal with deeply upsetting attempts at cancelling me was when an academic, really lovely, intelligent person, lady, who was a non-native speaker of English, came into my office, and she had a abridged copy of, I think it was Oliver Twist. It was a Charles Dickens book. And I was surprised that she had an abridged copy, because her English was really, really good and she's really, really bright. I was like, why are you reading the abridged copy? Now, I'm, a little bit autistic, so maybe that's a wrong question, but it was, and she was fine at the time. She was like, we just laughed about it. And I said, no, like, your English is amazing. Like, and you could easily handle this. Your English is better than most native speakers. And I stand by that. It's true. And she interpreted it completely fine. We laughed it off.
I don't see anything offensive in that at all.
No, but 2 weeks later, she exploded at me because other people had gone into her ear, and she said that was a microaggression, and actually I was trying to other her.
You were,
you're not a native speaker,
making her exotic, whatever that is, that
whatever,
exoticizing or whatever.
Yeah, and I was being racist against Japanese people. And my wife and kids are Japanese, but never mind.
So that was just like, we're going to look for offense. She didn't even feel it,
no,
but she.
I didn't even think that she looked for it. I think somebody else overheard
somebody
it,
else
because she was fine at the time.
Okay.
And she was even fine a few days afterwards, right? It happened a couple of weeks afterwards. So it had been kind of reinterpreted, and she had gone along with it. But here's the point. Obviously it was bad for me, but it wasn't good for her either. Because she wasn't just lashing out at me. I was the first person she lashed out at. But then she started lashing out at other people with this tyranny of the subjective, right? All that matters is how I feel. And if you don't validate my feelings, then that itself is a moral offense, right? So you don't have to, it's not just that you accept that this bad thing happened. You have to validate it. You have to enthusiastically say, oh, that is true. You're absolutely right to call this out, and it's really bad. And what does that do to somebody's head? Well, it makes them paranoid. Right?
Yeah, so everybody's out to get them at this point.
Everybody's out to get them.
Yeah.
And this poor individual would be alone in her office sobbing.
Yeah, gosh.
And that was the damage.
Because she's reading offense everywhere. She's been taught and trained that everybody is trying to hurt her feelings all the time.
Right. And so she was the victim of
Mhm.
psychological abuse.
Yeah.
She thought it was coming from me. It
Mhm.
wasn't, but it was coming from the kind of critical social, the dumbed down. Because I mean, actually,
Yeah.
the person who she got it from, I attempted to engage again on critical social justice. I attempted to
Mm.
go with Bell Hooks, who's a Black feminist writer, because she had
Mhm.
some interesting things to say. And I found out that she doesn't know what she was talking about. Not Bell Hooks,
Mm.
the woman who claims to idolize Bell Hooks.
Mhm. Mhm.
So this was who was getting to her, and she had been manipulated by this kind of, because we all like to be victims sometimes, and like, there is a kind of like a seductive kind of, it's like you've got like a sore on your tongue and you can't stop biting it just
Mhm.
to like have that
Mhm.
little bit of pain, right? There is a
Yeah.
kind of seductive nature in
Like
being
it's
a
like a
victim.
addictive indignation.
Yeah,
Mm.
self-righteous indignation.
Mhm.
Yeah, but it's, maybe a little bit of wallowing in grief is all right. If
Yeah.
you really must watch Schindler's List or something like that, then fine. But it can become pathological, and for her this was all real. She lives in this world in which she's constantly being bombarded by racist microaggressions,
And it's one
and
thing to
she's a
feel
basket
that and
case.
perceive it, but it's quite another thing to be deliberately trained to feel that way,
Well, here's the
which
thing.
seems like it's so malevolent to have an
No, it's
ideology
incredibly
that's
malevolent.
teaching people to feel
It's incredibly
like that all
malevolent.
the time.
And
Mm.
let's give Wingsu a little bit of credit here, because he has tried to make clear that this isn't what he intended by microaggressions. He doesn't tell us what
Mm.
he did intend by microaggressions, by the
I've
way.
read too much of his stuff to give him very much credit for
I know,
anything.
because like the first example he uses is on the aeroplane,
The
right? And he talks about
airplane,
like,
yes.
how
Oh
did they
yes.
didn't put me there because I'm ethnically? How do you
Yeah,
know?
I know.
So
It
it's like,
was there's so many variables he
so
leaves
it's kind
out.
of like, with Kimberly
Yeah.
Crenshaw as well, right? It's
Yeah.
like she is a more nuanced thinker, and people would
Mhm.
say, well, she hasn't said this. Yeah, but she hasn't spoken out against it either.
Mhm.
And she's hosted Iram X Kendi on a show, so
Mhm.
I'm happy to say that her earlier work is worth reading. It doesn't mean that I think that she deserves a break
Mhm.
in terms of her as an individual. But
Mhm.
we hold,
Mhm.
like, I'm a big fan of Wagner's music, but he was a horrible anti-Semite.
Mhm.
But anyway, so yeah, and the person, or the people who were manipulating this person, and this is typical, by the way, I think in my experience, that the people who were manipulating her um by trying to make her feel like she was a victim were doing so in a very dishonest way,
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
they were claiming to be victims, but they weren't showing any of the signs of being victims, right? So
Mhm.
when you're a victim, at the time of victimhood, and when you get over it, it's a different thing, but at the time of victimhood, you shut down. It becomes hard for you to engage with people. You do think of your social status as dropping. You
Mhm.
do become less confident in talking. You put yourself out there less because you think
Mhm.
that people are going to dislike you. And I've gone through this
Mhm.
because of some of these people and the things that they've said about me. I know what it feels like. And the woman who I complimented on English, who said I was guilty of a microaggression, she was for real.
Mhm.
You could see all of the signs of victimhood.
Mhm.
But the other people around her who were claiming to be victims, the kind of people who say, this is really difficult for me to say, or I'm going to be
Mhm.
brave, and say, yeah, you're not being brave. You're not showing
Mhm.
any of the signs of victimhood.
Mhm.
And so you could tell that they were disingenuous.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
there is the kind of division, isn't there? There's the wokies, I'm talking about the dumbed down version here.
Yeah.
There are the wokies who are the victims, who they will behave in appalling ways, but they are manifesting genuine victimhood, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So they're victims as well as perpetrators.
Mhm.
But then there is the kind of what I would call, and there's some psychological evidence for this as well. I would call them Machiavellian narcissists.
Mhm.
And there
Mhm.
is some psychological evidence to show that
That's
those
really
traits,
interesting. That's really
yeah.
interesting. So for context, at this point, when this happened to you and this
Mm,
woman came into your office, she was a colleague of yours. You were
yeah,
a professor at that time. And
yeah.
what you were teaching in a university, and what were you teaching, and how were you handling this were you being urged to incorporate this into your curriculum or
No,
your
because I'm in
teaching?
Japan.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, well, in some places in Japan, it is being incorporated. And look, I would be fine. I've read lots and lots of critical social justice. I would be absolutely fine incorporating critical
Hmm.
race theory, critical
Hmm.
social justice. critical theory, postmodernism, any of those into a class that I was going to do. I just wouldn't teach it in the way that the dumbed down wokies are. It would be, this is what some people are going to believe. I will try, and this is the way I usually teach, would be, I'm going to try and convince you of critical race theory in class 1. And then in class 2, I'm going to try and disabuse you of critical race theory, so you build up ideas and knock them down. But no, I've never received any pressure to teach that stuff.
Okay.
I think that certain people at my university then were. I probably shouldn't say which one it is. But certainly, I don't work there anymore. But certainly, people who, yeah, I saw it happening.
So you were in Japan, and you're are you British?
Yes, very English
origin. Okay, English. And so, sorry, I'm so terrible with accents. You could have been Welsh or something else. I wouldn't have necessarily. And I don't know my
Wales. I'd speak like this for you.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that, but that might have been a microaggression. Actually, I might have just. Oh,
good point.
Yeah. So you're a foreigner in Japan, and yet you are still considered to be the one in power. You're in the powerful position in this relationship because of the English. What is
according to the wokies, and the person who accused me was Japanese, but she had been indoctrinated in America. She wasn't.
But that's how it still works. Even in Japan, that's when they're pushing this in their own way. They're pushing it the same direction that it is in the Western.
I wouldn't say that it's got a foothold within Japanese culture. Like, the reason you get it in the universities here, and you don't get it much in the universities here, but the reason it is here in the universities is firstly because there are lots of foreign staff. Second, because the Japanese think that everything, not all Japanese, but many Japanese think that everything American is the way forward. You know,
so it's a fashion.
Like America. Yeah. And third, a lot of Japanese academics deliberately indoctrinate themselves in this stuff because they think that the sign of being more enlightened is by being more Western, which is complete nonsense, but that's what some of them are silly enough to believe.
That's so interesting. I wonder how some of the concepts that are so prevalent in the woke ideology over here would translate over there, like colonialism and stuff.
Sure. Some of them translate really well, some of them don't translate at all. So the idea of equity translates quite well into Japanese, because Japanese culture is a culture of mediocrity at times. So, for example, if I'm at a university and there are two people, and this has happened to me, by the way, a promotion opportunity has come up, but I have to apply for it. And there are two people going for the job, one of whom is widely known to be lazy and incompetent, and the other is known to be very hardworking, publishers in lots of prestigious places, you know, et cetera, et cetera. If those two people go for the job, if the lazy and incompetent person has been in the university for a longer period of time, they'll pretty much automatically get the promotion.
Okay.
Because
so
of the culture of seniority
means more. Okay.
Absolutely. No, I'm not saying that that's all Japanese companies. It is changing, but certainly within the education sector, that tends to remain true. And so that's kind of ties into this. That means that, I'm not saying it's a perfect translation of equity, but that means that kind of idea can come in when they can start to think of, okay, we need to have X number of Black people and X number of women and X number of, I mean, you are starting to see you're starting to see on education applications for university, female candidate preferred.
Oh, wow. Kind of stuff. Wow. Okay. Interesting.
So that does, but in terms of seeing yourself as a victim, that really doesn't translate into Japanese at all.
Okay.
Because they have a real, and you know, I'm not saying that some Japanese don't go down this route, they do, but they're generally the ones that have been indoctrinated overseas.
Okay.
Because Japanese culture places this real emphasis on gaman suru, which is this idea that you must persevere through a lot of hardship.
Okay, so this resilience and strength of,
if you've ever watched, do you ever watch any anime or read any manga?
Not very much. No, I haven't seen much. Okay.
But there's a famous manga anime called One Piece. It's just adapted into a Netflix live action.
Okay.
And it's about this pirate, and he's, you know, he's got this superpower, but compared to the other pirates who also have superpowers, he's fairly weak. And in one of the
Oh.
famous fights, he's fighting with this enemy, and it goes on for 7 episodes, maybe even more than that, of just him getting the absolute shit kicked out of him, like
Wow.
repeatedly.
Okay.
And that's like a metaphor for Japanese culture. And then finally,
Oh.
he gets this vision of his mind, of his team, his crew, his family, if you like. And then he's able to summon his inner strength. So in
Okay.
Japanese culture, there's this very big emphasis on you have to suffer. And
Mm.
so being fragile,
That doesn't go well with the culture.
doesn't go
Okay.
well. So it's
Okay.
kind of resistant in that sense.
That's really interesting.
Thank
And so
Christ.
when you were in this position with this happening with this colleague of yours, was that what you said? You referred to that as one time when there was an attempted cancellation, and it sounds like it was
Yeah.
a really significant event. Was that what led to you no longer working at the university? Is that why you left?
I survived both of my attempted cancellations.
Okay.
I look, I think I'm in a weird position that my first encounter with this stuff was online in a relatively inconsequential, just with some idiots who told me to educate me myself, but that was it. Like there was no kind of sort of Damocles hanging over my head. And so when I encountered wokies in the wild, I was already quite well equipped to deal with them. And deal with them I have. So I wouldn't say that, no, the process of having to deal with them has been extremely painful, but I felt like I've come off the better. And they haven't, my last job came to an end because in Japan, it's just universities generally hire on fixed term contracts, and then you have to go somewhere else, and you have to go somewhere else. So they didn't, it has been more difficult for me to find employment because some of them have tried to say that I'm a homophobe. Which is really funny because they can't actually give an example of me doing anything homophobic.
So
not
just
even a
choosing that
microaggression,
as a label.
just
Wow,
making it up.
that's interesting.
Yeah, it was really funny because at the university, this teacher who accused me of she spread all kinds of rumors about me being a homophobe.
Wow.
She poisoned my reputation like awfully, and that's really made it difficult for me to find jobs elsewhere. But
is that a very bad thing in Japan? Is that a very
within the
protective
university sector it is.
Okay, because it's similar with the LGBT. Okay.
Yeah, of course. And fine. I mean, I've got no time for homophobes.
I just wonder why they would choose that label. Is it something that's particularly?
No, it was really, really weird. It was a really, really weird label because actually my sister's gay.
Okay.
And we're very close. Like I had two best friends at university. One of them was gay. Sadly, he died. I've had lots of like relationships with gay people.
So it's just a totally from left field accusation.
Completely out of nothing.
Yeah.
Completely out of nowhere. I've never, I've loads of gay people who know me very well. Anyway, and so she managed to get a job for this person at the university who was gay, and he went into the university determined to hate me. Like absolutely determined, like chomping at the bit, like to have a pop at me. And then he met me and realized it was all bullshit, and now we're really good friends. which is really interesting. So yeah, I know I've been able to push back at them, but I have had other attempts on my reputation and trying to deal with me. But I think there are ways of dealing with these people that are not necessarily well understood.
What do you have any practical advice for people who are dealing with this, and what are your suggestions?
I do, but I have to couch it because I'm not sure that everybody can do this. And it's not hard from a logical point of view, but from a psychological point of view, it's very difficult because it means you have to go through a lot of trauma. So what I did, well, the first thing that you don't do is you do not apologize. Now you can say something like, I'm sorry that you feel that way, right? But you can't say, I'm sorry for doing this, right? Because then if they say you apologize, say, no, I said, I'm sorry that you feel that way, and I am. I didn't do anything. you know, and you don't know my mind better than I do, right? You can't mind read me. I'm not buying into the standpoint epistemology telepathy. Not that they would know what standpoint epistemology is, because again, these people don't read. Even the academics don't read. That's why they just teach Twitter. So don't get involved with them don't do what I first did, which is just read all of the literature and then expect to have a debate with them, because they don't know their stuff. And that won't help. I mean, it might help because it might get them enraged, but here's what you do first. Don't apologize. Remain courteous and be polite at all times, but firmly push back. And the more you do that, the more angry they're going to get, because what they want you to do, because remember their whole, you know, the Bradley and Manning, have you read their book, The Victimhood Seeking Morality? So the idea is,
what is it? Bradley who?
Let me have a look. I'll just look it up.
Okay, that's fine. Victimhood seeking.
The Victimhood Seeking Morality.
Okay.
Manning and Campbell's Safe Spaces. Here we go. The Rise of Victimhood Culture, Microaggressions, Safe Spaces, and the New Culture Wars. That was 2018.
Will you send me that link, and then I'll pop it into the description. So if anybody wants to look that up, that sounds interesting.
Yeah, it's really worth reading, and I'll kind of give you the synopsis of it now. Okay, I just sent it to you in the chat.
Awesome, thanks.
The idea is that we grew up so before us, if you think of like the Wild West, there was like, or inner city gangs in New York, there's like an honor culture, right? It's like, you don't diss me, or I demand satisfaction, you know, and then you'd apologize or you'd get involved in a duel or something like that. You always have to preserve your honor. So the idea is that we grow out of that kind of morality into a dignity morality, which is kind of more Christian in nature, in which you don't have to be a Christian to participate in it. But this idea that there is this kind of divine spark inside of you that is immune to external criticism. So
it's like the sticks and stones.
Exactly, right, which is stupid from one point of view, right? Because words really can fuck you up.
Yeah, that's true.
Arguably more than sticks and stones generally do, right? But as a moral code, it's actually quite enlightened, because it is trying to say that, you know, you have this inner thing that is a spark of the divine that can't be transgressed upon, and therefore, you know, you shouldn't see yourself as a victim. And if somebody says something racist or homophobic to you, of course that's bad, but that doesn't
but you have a core that's not impacted.
Correct. Your dignity,
right?
And so now we've moved from the dignity culture that I think we grew up with. So for example, you know, if a man says something inappropriate to you, then, which happens to women, right, that's fucking horrible, but it doesn't mean that dignity of inside you has been assaulted, right?
Right.
That you just have to, unfortunately you have to deal with that. You have to roll with the punches. This is life. That's what we grew up with. But now it's moved over to this victimhood seeking culture, in which we are allocated social status for being victims, or whether that victimhood is real or not, right? Because lots of people fake it. You know, the good side of it is that we give status to genuine victims. The bad side of this, and again, if you go on the Dissidents podcast, we go through the psychological evidence for this. There is empirical evidence for this. Is that there are lots of bad actors who will fake victimhood and gain status. And by the way, they will then take resources away from genuine victims. So the victimhood culture, the victimhood seeking morality, it seeks to allocate resources to victims, again, real or not, or those seeking to intervene on behalf of victims. And the problem is that there is a shortage of the things that cause victimhood. So, for example, if I was to say anti-Black racism in the United States, where do you think it would be most common?
Where in the United States? Anti-Black racism?
People who hate Black people. White people who hate Black people. Where would they probably
stereotypically live? In the South, Southeast.
Right? Would they be rich or poor?
Poor.
Or would they be powerful?
No.
Would they be likely to attend a prestigious university?
No.
So at a prestigious university where this whole kind of victimhood seeking morality, they have like a critical shortage of bigots. Like, what? We've constructed a whole identity around being bigots, and we want to present ourselves as being heroes, as either victims or those who are interceding on behalf of victims. That's our narrative, our story, you know, we're as allies. And great, you know, if you genuinely have bigots, then that's not a problem. So wokeism ceases to become a problem and might actually be a good thing if you're in a situation where there are lots of actual bigots. The problem is there aren't any, or very few, and those who genuinely do have those opinions within a prestigious American university are going to be silent because they will know what the consequences of speaking those opinions will be.
Right.
And so what happens then is that you can't find real evil. You can't find
go
real
on a witch hunt.
Yeah, so you have to invent it. Just in order to create your narrative of being this person who is gaining social status and getting those nice little endorphin hits for standing up on behalf of the victims of racism or of sexism or of homophobia. And again, it's not to say that these things don't exist in America. Of course they do, but where do they exist? I'm sure there are some bigots in American universities, but I'm sure they don't talk about their bigotry very often. And I would say that
unless
these things
it's the other way around, and then you hear plenty.
Well, right, well then it's okay. Well, yeah. I mean, I've been
the endorsed bigotry of the day is a different flavor.
Quite, and I've been dismissed like to my face as being cis, heterosexual, and white. I just don't understand what there is to be insulted about that.
There was that phrase that I heard, several times when I was in graduate school. It was the first time I'd heard it, and it was about cis het white men.
Yeah,
cis het white men, and and I was like, "What are you even saying? I don't understand."
No,
break that down slow for me, because I don't understand the word you're saying. And
none of those things mean anything. Like
no, it's a slur.
And a bizarre one. And how would you on the one hand think that it's terrible to accuse a black person of being bad because they're black, and yet it's not, it's white. And by the way, there are critical social justice scholars, I know a couple, who'd be completely on point with this. You go, yeah, it's fucking weird. What's wrong with these people? So it's very, very, very odd.
And so then go, that's really great. You're going into this. Back? Well, you got don't apologize, remain courteous and polite, push back,
but turn the other cheek. So here's what you've got to do.
Okay.
You've got to make them show their true colors. So the more you hold the line, the more you stay courteous and polite, the more angry they're going to get, because they belong to the victimhood seeking culture. They are looking to be a victim. They are they want you to react angrily. They want you to say fuck off. And you would be perfectly morally justified in telling them to fuck off. Right. Fuck off, you idiot. That would be absolutely fine. But then what they're going to do is they're going to switch on, I'm the victim now. And they're going to start crying and start saying, this is how women are talked to, or this is how black people are talked to, or this is how queer people are talked to, or this is how people who stand up for gay people are talked to. And they're just going to go off on one. And they have a good story, by the way. And by the way, when I say a good story, I don't mean a good story in the sense that it's anybody should be convinced by it, that it's not logically coherent or accurate, but it's a good story insofar as it plays on people's heartstrings and it resonates with people. And I'm sorry, I wish it didn't, but it does. And if it didn't, it would be as powerful. It wouldn't be as powerful as it is. So it resonates with people naturally. And so that's how they do it. So they are begging you to lose your rag with them. They're begging you, and look, never do what your enemy. This I'm in war theory, right? That's my field, right? Never ever do what your enemy wants you to do. It's really not a good idea. Toe the line, push back logically, calmly. They will get more and more frustrated, particularly if they're kind of malignant narcissists, which a lot of the people, the disingenuous people who would be leading the mobbings, the witch hunts, they tend to be. The people who go along with it, not so much. But generally, the people who might be offended, and it might be case one, maybe not so much, but the people who are leading the witch hunts tend to be quite malignant narcissists, in my opinion. Again, my opinion, right? I'm not saying that there's research to back this up, but there is research that says that there are narcissists involved, but in terms of whether they lead witch hunts or not, there isn't. So you have to toe the line, frustrate them, because you not losing begging you, they really, really want you, and they're going to get more and more and more vicious. In my case, they were trying to send messages telling me to kill myself, telling me that I'm the laughing stock wherever I went, telling me that everybody hated me, telling me that nobody would take me seriously in life, all of these things, right?
That's
all
terrible.
of these really terrible. Yeah, but it's exactly
really
what
toxic.
I wanted them to do. It was exactly what I wanted them to do.
But it shows them for what they are.
Shows them for what they are. And if you've been polite through all of this, and they are saying things like this to your face, behind your back, in private, there will be people. I can't say they will be, because it will depend upon the context within which you operate. I mean, there are some contexts that are just too far gone, unfortunately. But I would guess within most institutions, there will be people who will recognize this for what it is. And there may be people who speak up on your behalf. So the people who spoke up on my behalf, some of them were wokies, which was quite interesting. So not everybody who buys into this ideology is going to behave in this kind of really awful way. Sometimes they won't. And yeah, and that's turn the other cheek. Don't turn the other cheek. Doesn't, this is like a big misinterpretation of Christianity. I'm not a Christian, by the way, but this is a misinterpretation of Christianity. Turn the other cheek doesn't mean back away like a coward, right? It means literally don't throw down in the way that they're throwing down. Be smarter than them. Let them say, because eventually they'll hang themselves, and that's what they do. And that's the way in which I've been successful in dealing with them. And they've apologized to me as well, which has been quite interesting.
Wow. Well, I think that's really great advice. I think that, and it, in a way, to a lesser extent, because I didn't face that kind of toxic bullying at my school, it was different. It was more on the level of the institution, not these people telling me these horrible things that you were told. But I'm sure that was being said about me. In fact, I saw some Twitter threads about me when I first started putting out my videos. But they did. I felt that they did exactly that. They really showed their true colors when they issued a notice to all the students that I was a white supremacist, based on, you could see my videos and you could see that was absolutely ridiculous to say. But when they're calling me, I mean, it really felt like exactly what you're saying. It shows how ridiculous their position is.
No, absolutely, completely ridiculous. And we have to remember that people like this have held power, but they don't for long periods of time. And look, if you're one of them, this is not going to be a good look in 10 years' time. I mean, it really is extremely cringe. In 10 years' time, when this is all past, at least you and I are going to be able to say, no, look, I stood up to it. Here's YouTube videos of me standing up to it. They're still there, unless they've been purged by some wokey at YouTube, which could happen.
I appreciate your optimism.
I am an optimist. I think that many people aren't, but I also think that this movement, wokery is not the same as communism, but it shares some key features, right? Again, communism is different insofar as it's much more conciliatory, at least when they're not in power. When they get into power, then you start to see the similarities between wokery and communism, and that is the fact that they both, we alluded to it a second ago, they need a steady stream of victims. So with the Bolsheviks, first it was the rich people. They were all accused of being traitors or bourgeoisie or whatever, and they were shot or sent to freeze to death on some gulag in Siberia. Then they ran out of rich people. It was the Mensheviks, who were the people that they were their comrades. Okay, we have some differences, but we can work them out. We're on the same team. And they got rid of them. They were sent to the gulags, and then the Mensheviks were gone. And then it was the Bolsheviks themselves. Like, you think you're okay? Like, you look at the pictures of Soviet Party conferences from one year and the next year, like half of them have been purged, right? Same thing's happening right now with Xi Jinping, right? Xi Jinping right now is just purging everybody who's competent, and it's completely destroying China. It's like China as a country is basically done. There's no way back from it now. I mean, they're completely done. So it's this same principle, and this is what they're doing. So they're already running out of people to cancel, right? They've run out of bigots. Now they've got now they're trying to cancel, I don't know, moderates. I guess. Like, I'd consider myself to be a moderate. I wouldn't consider myself to be right wing. I maybe slightly left of center, center-ish. Do you know what I mean? So now they're going after moderates. but you know, they'll run out of moderates, and increasingly they're going to go after each other. I mean, you see them going after each other. There was some guy on Twitter who was like, he was really woke, and he said, "I don't like fat Americans" or something like that, and then he got accused of fat shaming people or something. I'm so sorry. And he said, "Fuck off, you twat." No,
it's a purity spiral.
Right off. No,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah.
And so that's why an ideology like this just eats itself. I mean, it's evil, isn't it? Like, evil is stupid. Evil never works out well for anybody. I mean, you can be a smart person and do evil things. They don't benefit you. I mean, evil just ends up destroying itself always, and it will do here. And that doesn't make me religious. It's just an observation from history. So I am very optimistic that these people will destroy themselves. And good on you if you're one of the few people who are, you know, putting yourself out there and standing up to it, because I think you will reap the rewards in future. I really do, for the bravery that you have now.
I think that is lovely. I love the upbeat take on this, and it makes me feel really happy to hear somebody present things that way. I also think that we're probably going to round the bend, and that this will be pretty, as you say, cringe in just a few years' time.
But it's already getting that way, isn't it? Like, it's already like
we're going to have to deal with the fallout for a long time. So I think that there's some serious issues that will come consequent. You know, that what's happening in education and the children. This is going to be a long process, slogging out of it. But I do think that a lot of these in-your-face, blatant things, they're just not going to survive much longer. I don't believe.
No, and like, already some of it is cringe. Like, when you think of a white person, Black Lives Matter, it's just like so fucking cringe. Not that Black lives don't matter, of course they do, but the whole kind of like
that whole
of like posturing is just so cringe. Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I've got is that kids rebel.
Yeah.
Right. So when these kids become teenagers, are they really going to be like, you know, all these sad middle-aged people who are kind of like coming out with these cringeworthy ideas that have obvious holes in them? You know, are they going to adhere to that stuff? I doubt it. I mean, that's what young people do. They push back against the folly of earlier generations, and they'll have people like us to help them out. And help them out we shall.
Yes, indeed. Mike, it's been such a pleasure talking with you. I really enjoyed it.
The pleasure was all mine. I hope
Can you tell everybody where to find you and say it out loud for those who are hearing it? And I'll put the links down below as well.
Yeah, so my Twitter handle is Mike, let me just check. At Mike_Burke, BURKE_UK. And if you go to YouTube, type in the Dissidents podcast or the Dissidents Institute for Liberal Values, if you can find it. You can also find it on Apple or Spotify or any of those things. We're on there, and we talk about Elizabeth's, again, my background, psychology, philosophy, that kind of thing, education. Elizabeth's a professor of psychology, so she kind of covers that angle, and we look at the psychological causes and ramifications of cancel culture, and what we can do about it. Good. But
excellent.
yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Not at all, pleasure. Good.